following the release of the commercially successful but very divisive sequel to The Last of Us in June. Sony have followed this up with a brand new IP from Sucker Punch, the creators of the infamous series, called Ghost of Tsushima. Ghost of Tsushima is an open world stealth action game set in feudal Japan, where you play the role of a samurai fighting for his homeland against the Mongol invasion. Despite being relatively cliche in terms of its story and gameplay, this game feels like the most perfected version of the open world formula to date. But does that immediately make it a good game? I'm TJFL, like and subscribe if you're new around here, and this is my review of Ghost of Tsushima. Ghost of Tsushima has you experience the island of Tsushima from the perspective of Jin Sakai. Raised as a samurai from a young age, Jin is an expert at swordsmanship who lives strictly by the samurai code and its teachings. But after an event very early on in the story, Jin finds himself at a crossroads as to whether to honour his samurai code to fight the Mongols, or stray on a different path and become a ghost, and do things that the samurai would deem dishonourable to win the battle against the Mongols. Jin's character is not the most charismatic of characters that you have ever got to play in a video game, but his internal moral dilemma is well thought out and helps to give real weight to the choices he has to make as a samurai or as the ghost. There are a good wealth of side characters who are with Jin for his journey through his adventure on the island of Tsushima. And for me, I felt the relationships he had with these characters are really what kept me invested in the overall story, as they all have relatable motives and feel like real people just trying to survive during this war against the Mongols. Without going into spoilers, the main story itself is rather cliche, and what you've come to expect from a typical samurai story. But despite being able to spot some story beats from a mile off, I still really enjoyed the journey just because the relationships between all the characters were so well built up that it didn't matter that I had seen this similar sort of storytelling before. I just wanted to see how these characters that I have come to care for react to the different events in the game. But what really makes Ghost of Tsushima shine is its world. The island of Tsushima is hands down the most visually appealing world we have ever seen so far in a video game. The use of contrast and saturated colours gives us something which might not be photorealistic, but instead something which is just gorgeous to look at and constantly leaves you with a dropped jaw. The lush green vegetation rolling over the fields, the crimson red leaves being carried by the wind, or even the brightly coloured yellow birds that lead you to hidden treasures. Everything feels so vibrant and alive and makes every moment look like the perfect snapshot. One thing you'll notice straight away is the lack of a minimap or directional compass in the Ghost of Tsushima. And that's because the way that this game chooses to navigate you through the world is with environmental cues. The wind will blow in the direction of your next waypoint, and with a swipe up on the PS4's touchpad, a large gust will blow to show you more clearly in which direction you need to head. At first I found this a little annoying, as I never exactly knew where I was supposed to be going. But then it actually allowed me to really pay attention to my surroundings, not just a marker on the map. Because of this, I found myself more inclined to stop off at places of interest during my travels, which provided a new way of exploration I haven't really had before in any other game. The same can also be said for side quests. There are quite a few side quests dotted along the island, but instead of loading up the map, selecting a destination and heading to one, I found myself encountering them just during my exploration of the island, which felt much more organic than what I have experienced in other similar open world games. What also brings the world of Tsushima more to life is its soundtrack. This soundtrack is probably my most favourite soundtrack in a video game this year, topping even Last of Us 2. It truly helps immerse you in this Japanese setting with all the sounds and emotional cues you'd expect to hear in a great samurai film. The gameplay for me is where things start to get a little bit shaky. The combat system feels like the love child of the Arkham series and Sekiro, but fails to successfully pull off either form. You have your typical block, parry and dodge maneuvers, which are now fairly standard in most Souls-esque games. But instead of being able to focus on one enemy with a lock-on function, Jin relies on directional input of the stick to coordinate his strikes. Throwing the gadget wheels reminiscent of the Arkham games, and you have a pretty unique but fiddly gameplay formula. But Ghost of Tsushima takes it a step further and adds in stances. Stances are essentially different combat styles Jin must use against the appropriate enemy types to be able to inflict the most damage and break that particular enemy's defense. But for myself, I found the mix-up of all these different types of combat mechanics just too much and too finicky, that I found myself spending more time checking I was in the right stance than just enjoying the combat. But then when it came to delivering the strikes, I felt that although what I saw on the screen looked good, it didn't necessarily feel good to pull off. Despite the gameplay looking as if it's meant to be fast moving like the Arkham games, I felt the control of Jin was just too much like the Souls games, where it is slow and deliberate, but ineffective against large crowds, which in most cases is what you'll find yourself in during your combat encounters. But by also taking away the use of a lock-on system, meant I was also battling with the camera half the time as well. Thankfully, Ghost of Tsushima isn't level based, with the enemies having inflated HPs to make them more spongy. There are a good variety of enemies which you have to tackle differently, but all of them will fall after just a few well placed strikes of your katana. I'm extremely grateful and appreciative of Sucker Punch's decision to make the enemies actually challenging, instead of just claiming they are more difficult by super inflating their HP. It's not so much that I think that this is a bad combat system, and I can definitely see why people can enjoy it, but I believe we have seen much better iterations of this sort of combat style, and that if Tsushima had settled for more of a traditional Soul or a traditional Arkham, it might have been more enjoyable and satisfying to play. Instead, the combat to me feels just above average with extremely fiddly controls. As most reviews are praising the combat, I feel the best way I can justify my opinion is to compare it to that of Jedi Fallen Order. Fallen Order brought the Souls-like combat to the mainstream audience, while maintaining the arcadic and flashiness of the Arkham games. Just like in the Arkham games, you can face off against a large group of enemies, yet your attacks are deadly enough that you can take on these groups with relatively little challenge. Cal's combat mechanics feel tight and responsive to your inputs, and with the ability to lock onto a target, you feel you command the battlefield much more than you do in Tsushima. Had Tsushima kept the combat more streamlined like it is in Fallen Order, instead of making it overcomplicated, I would have definitely found the combat experience much more enjoyable. What is definitely more enjoyable though, are the standoffs and set pieces. As you approach an enemy patrol or outpost, you can request a standoff, in which the black bars drop and creates a sequence where you have to rely on your quick reflexes to quickly dispatch an enemy in one strike. Despite being as easy as just releasing the button at the right time, I found the enemy feints quite believable, and I didn't manage to pull off every standoff successfully. But when you do, you truly feel like a samurai master. The set pieces where you have one-on-one duels are also some of the most memorable moments of the game, and ironically enough, it's also when the combat system truly works best and shines unlike it does in the standard combat. These duels are intense and challenging and really make you feel like the samurai you wish to be. But what if you choose to play as the Ghost? Well, unfortunately again, I feel like this wasn't the best iteration of a stealth experience I've seen in an open world video game, and unlike its combat system, it doesn't do anything to set itself apart from other great stealth games. If you choose to play the Ghost style, it's very in line with the basics of a core stealth experience. Hide in bushes, assassinate from above, shoot from afar, use decoys to draw the enemy away. It's all very familiar, but what really breaks this experience for me is the enemy AI. It's probably the worst AI I have seen in a stealth game for a while now. They are just too easy to fool and break line of sight with, that the result is I feel punched out of the game by its lack of immersion of being a suspense-filled stealth experience. If anyone knows me, I love my stealth games and will always take the stealth approach if possible. But I found that in Ghost of Tsushima, the stealth experience was so bare bones and the AI so dumb that I preferred to just run in and mow everyone down. It's a shame, as I was really looking forward to the experience of playing as the Ghost, but ultimately found the experience of being a ghost quite boring and dull. The game also has some very light platforming features too, such as a grappling hook and also being able to traverse the landscape and buildings to reach vantage points or treasures. But again, the experience feels very stiff and clunky, which I suppose is fine for just general exploration, but when trying to use it during a stealth playthrough, it isn't precise enough to allow you to be more versatile in your approach. I found myself many a time just jumping in front of an enemy instead of trying to jump to the next building over, which is again something I just haven't experienced in a stealth game for quite some time now. You level up Jin and unlock more abilities as you play through the game, and you can choose whether to invest your points into the Ghost playstyle or that of the Samurai. What I can say is that the game is quite rewarding in terms of the rate that you accrue skill points, and I'd say don't worry too much about whether you go more Ghost or more Samurai, as by the end of the game I had near enough maxed out every ability the game had to offer. A lot of how I feel about this game is how I felt about Sucker Punch's last game. Infamous Second Son, despite being a very beautiful and well animated game, the combat experience was just very clunky and uninviting to use. I couldn't tell you how many times I've tried to go back to Infamous to complete the game, because I love the characters and the world and its superhero setting, but every time I just find myself frustrated by its tedious parkour mechanics and stiff aiming. Yet despite my criticisms of the gameplay, I still really enjoyed the overall game. And if Sucker Punch chooses to add a new game plus at a later date, I might find myself being drawn back into this game once more. Having already spent 40 to 50 hours in this world already, I can't get enough of it. The world of Tsushima is just so beautiful and inviting. Jin and his friends have such a relatable relationship, and even though the story is very cliche, it does its best to make it its own truly emotional tale with a believable moral dilemma holding it all together. But for me, outside of the exploration and truly spectacular set pieces, I found the gameplay a real chore to enjoy at times, and despite having its moments of making me feel like a samurai, I always felt somewhat irritated during battles by the excessive amount of controls and the slow unresponsiveness of Jin's attacks, combined with a very basic stealth system. Considering the title and the core storyline is that of the Ghost, the actual stealth elements are so underwhelming and disappointing to anyone who enjoys stealth games. If you took away the world, the story and the characters and left just the gameplay, I believe that the gameplay would not be seen as that of a AAA title we would expect in 2020. And if we were to go just off that basis of purely just the gameplay, I'd be giving this game a 5 out of 10 for being just an average Arkham Sekiro style clone. But because of all the other elements of the game being of such high tier, especially the world of Tsushima itself, I'm giving Ghost of Tsushima a strong 7 out of 10.